We are back again with this E90. This is a 2007 BMW 328i. It's my cousin's car and we've done a lot of maintenance on here over the past few weeks. But finally we're going to do some mods. We're going to be installing this budget coilover system by ECS Tuning. Now this might be considered a mod, but it's also going to be considered maintenance because this car has over 170,000 miles and all of the struts and shocks are completely stock. They're the original ones that came with the car and they're all blown. So installing these is going to be a huge upgrade, and we're not looking to lower the car too much, but we are going to be installing this entire coilover system. Now whenever you're lowering your car, whether it's with lowering springs or a different type of coilover system, you want to make sure you have that camber adjustability, because whenever you lower a car, it automatically is going to have some more negative camber. So you want to try to correct that as much as you can to get it into the proper alignment specs to save your tires. Now this car, we're not going to be lowering it too much. We're just going to probably lower it ½ an inch or whatever the minimum lowering capabilities of this coilover system is, because this is going to be my cousin's daily driver. So we just want to make sure it is not bouncing around like it is right now. This process is going to be very similar to most E9x rear-wheel drive cars. It will also be kind of similar for the all-wheel drive people as well, just a little bit more difficult like everything is whenever you have an all-wheel drive BMW. But let's just get right to it, take off all this old bouncy junk, and get the new shiny goods in. Since we're using the ECS Tuning E90 coilovers, there are a couple of things that we are going to need for the rear end. So for the rear coilovers, we're going to need a new lower mount. We're also going to need a new upper mount. The lower section of the upper mount and the top section of the upper mount, as well as a shock mount insulator, because none of this stuff is included with the ECS Tuning coilovers. So you're going to need one set for each side. And I'll have all this stuff linked down below. A tool that's going to make your life a lot easier is one of these things which spreads the pinch for the front struts. This one I just got off of Amazon. It was like 20 bucks. I mean, you could use like a hex key or a chisel or something to pry it open a little bit, but this is going to make it much easier and much safer. So we're going to start with the front suspension. I've already done the entire driver's side, so we're just going to show you everything on the passenger side. So first things first, up here we're going to be removing the strut bar. So you want to start in the middle. There's a cap that covers a bolt that's underneath there. Just want to twist it counterclockwise, and then it pops right out. There's an external Torx 18 bolt inside. We just need to loosen that a couple of threads. That way the strut bars on each side can slide out. Now on the strut towers is going to be an external Torx 14 bolt on each side. That was already loose. Now you just lift up and it slides out. So you can see how it's slotted. So one slides under the other and the bolt secures them. So underneath the car, we're actually going to be loosening the two control arm bolts. That way the bushings can pivot and move around without putting too much stress on them when we drop the entire spindle. So for this one, you're going to need an 18mm wrench and 18mm socket. And just loosen a couple threads. And for the front control arm, you're just going to need an 18mm socket. Now we don't have any of our plastic covers underneath. If you do have your plastic covers, make sure you have them removed before this step. The only thing different on the driver's side is going to be this headlight level sensor. You're going to want to take off this 10mm nut and counter hold the stud with the 10mm open-ended wrench. And the nut is going to be on this side, and you're going to counter hold on this side. Next up, we're going to remove this entire sway bar link because the ECS Tuning coilover system comes with an adjustable one. So we're going to remove it from the bottom, from the sway bar, as well as the strut itself. So you remove the nut, whatever size you have. Ours is a 17, and then you hold this section if it's spinning. For us, this is going to be a 16. We're going to be removing this 18mm bolt that holds the knuckle to the actual strut itself. Now this is a pinch right here, so even if you remove the bolt, it's not just going to fall down. We're going to have to open up this pinch. That way it gets enough clearance for the strut to move around and we could drop the whole knuckle down. So you're going to have an 18mm bolt on one side and an 18mm nut on the other side. With the bolts out, we can actually remove this bracket that's holding in the wire for the speed sensor. So it just slides out. We're just gonna let that rest to the side. And now I'm gonna bring the car down before I do this, but here's a tool that I was talking about to spread this pinch. That way we can get the strut out. So the tool is just gonna slide into the pinch, and then you tie in this bolt right here, and it's gonna spread the entire pinch, and that's gonna give us enough clearance to pull the knuckle off of the strut. I've got the pinch tool installed, and I already tightened up that bolt so the pinch is open. Now you can see that this whole spindle is actually moving free of the strut. I've got a jack supporting this whole spindle assembly. I'm jacking it from that straight control arm underneath, and the jack's gonna just control how fast this thing comes down. And you just wanna make sure you're not gonna put any stress on the brake lines or the connector right here for the speed sensor. Now on the driver's side, you're gonna have the same stuff, except you're also gonna have one more sensor for the brake pad wear. So you wanna make sure none of those sensors or nothing is getting too much pressure on there, and make sure all these brackets are free. So I'm gonna slowly bring it down. Now the only thing holding the strut in place are these three 13mm nuts. Once you have that last one left, grab the strut from the bottom. And you can see just how bad this one is. The entire strut mount is separated. So here's the new coilover compared with the old strut. Now we're not gonna be lowering this car too much, but on most coilovers, the way you're gonna adjust the height is by actually adjusting the lower mount itself on this threaded body. So you would just twist and turn this to adjust the height, and the spring stays where it's at. Now most coilover companies, when they're producing these coilovers, they'll usually preload the spring a certain amount. We're gonna preload it about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. And the reason we do that is that way when the suspension's at full droop, we don't want this spring just dangling around. So you want it preloaded a certain amount, that way there's always tension on that spring. So as you can see right now, this spring just turns freely. There's no tension on it. So we're gonna tighten this one right here, and you'll see the spring compress. And we can fine tune all of this once the strut's already on the car. Now you do want to make sure the coilovers are different. The driver's side is going to be different than the passenger side, mainly for where the actual sway bar link goes. So you want to make sure you have the right one, compare it to this dowel pin right here, and that's what guides it into the knuckle. That way the whole coilover won't be able to twist and turn. Once this slides in, then we know that's good. So now I went ahead and transferred this plate. This is just a reinforcement plate that was on the stock strut assembly. So we just transfer that over. It does have a gasket on here, it's just a paper gasket. If you have a new one, go ahead and put it on there. Besides that, now the main thing that we need to ensure, so the aftermarket coilovers and even any other kind of camber plates or anything like that, they're not gonna have the alignment stud on this top hat. So what you need to do, since we have these camber adjustability on these coilovers, we wanna make sure that this camber adjustability allows us to move the actual coilover body independent of the top hat this way. So you want to make sure the orientation of the bolts is properly installed when you put this strut mount up onto the car. I'll show you as I'm doing it. So you can see how the bolts are going to allow us to move this actual coilover body this way whenever we loosen these hex bolts. And that's just going to be for alignment specs to adjust the camber. Now this dowel needs to go inside of this opening on the pinch, and that's how it's going to align the coilover itself to the spindle. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure we twist it. You can leave this lower section loose. That allows us to move this whole lower section independent of the coilover. And now we're going to use the jack to jack the spindle back up. You want to leave this in place as well, that way it keeps that pinch separated. And we're going to go ahead and get that dowel lined up. Now we can remove our tool and that pinch will close back up. You do want to make sure that this bracket is routed properly. You can see how it's kind of molded already. So it only goes in one way. And we're going to go ahead and slide the bracket in place. And then we can put the bolt back through. Now this bracket is just going to go up here when we put the sway bar link in. So now when you're adjusting the height, we're just going to actually be threading this whole section in and out of this lower section to adjust the height. So if you want to increase the height, you want the ride height to be higher, you would go counterclockwise, and that's going to separate these two. And the whole spindle, everything's just going to go further down. Now if you wanted to lower the car more, you would clockwise thread it back into the lower body itself. It would be a great idea to put some kind of white lithium grease or some kind of rust protectant on here. That way you don't ever have to worry about it in the future. Now another thing is you want to make sure that the height of both sides are the same. So you can actually use some kind of measuring tape or whatever you have to measure the distance of this threaded section. And you want to also make sure the preload is set the same as well. You can measure the spring itself and make sure it's the same on both sides. Now as you can see, we're at full droop and this spring has nowhere to move. So we're good here. Now I'm going to be adjusting the ride height later on once we have everything else put in, once I've replaced other parts of the suspension. So I'm not going to show that section here. But next step, what we're going to do is we're going to put the sway bar link in. And once you have your ride height and everything set properly, then you want to go ahead and tighten these collars. And there's tools that come with coilovers. No matter what coilover system you get, they're going to come with the tool for these collars. You want to tighten the bottom one to lock this section in. And you want to tighten this one against this top one to lock in that spring. So here we have the adjustable sway bar links. Both ends are independent. You can increase the length or decrease it. Now the way you want to do this is going to be based on the ride height that you have set. So right now we're just going to have it at the very adjusted position, at the very tightest position. We're going to go ahead and install it. This end goes to the coilover. This end goes to the sway bar itself. They're both interchangeable. It doesn't matter because we can twist them around. And once you have that, you want to set the sway bar link height based on your ride height, like I said. So once you have all of your coilovers, everything installed, you're going to set the car down on its own weight, and that's when you're going to tighten the control arms as well. Once you have that ride height dialed in and you have the car on its own weight, then you're going to adjust the sway bar, make sure that there's enough space between all of the arms and everything, so that way you can move up and down, and then you lock it in place. And to lock it, you would just use this nut, thread it down, and it locks it against this collar itself. So let's go ahead and install the link to the coilover body. And the lower section goes to the sway bar. Let's move on to the rear. So we're going to start in the trunk because we do need to disassemble some of the carpet. In order to get the carpeting out from the sides, first you take out the middle section that just lifts up and out. Then we need to remove this trim. So you're going to have two covers right here. These tabs cover it like this. So you want to lift up on the section where there's an opening, pry up the tab, and slide it out so you don't break this section right here. You have one right there and one right here. And then inside you're going to have two Phillips screws. So remove both of the Phillips screws. Then all along the inside you're going to have four of these push tabs. So in order to remove those, you want to separate this section from this inside section. Pull this tab out, and then you can pull the entire pin out. And you can use two trim tools like this. Use a small one to pry it out first, and then you use the big one to pull out the whole thing. Now once you have all four of those removed, and the two screws, then you want to get the whole plastic section. It's going to get held up on these hooks, so you just want to be careful of that. Pull the bottom out first, and then you're going to have this weather seal holding it in place. So lift up the weather seal. Pops right out. On the driver's side, you're gonna have 3 more of these black push pins. Same concept as those gray ones. You're gonna have one right here, one on the top, and one right here. Then you're also gonna have this plastic trim. There's a hook right here, and that's just gonna be held in with this T40 Torx bolt. So take the bolt out, then this plastic trim pops out, and then you wanna pull the outside section out first. Once you have that out, it's gonna be like crooked like this, and then you wanna slide this out from the back section. That lip is hard to get out and hard to get back in. Well, now we have this section exposed. There is a rubber plug on it. I'm telling you, cars are just, man, all kinds of sexual innuendos everywhere. And then you expose the nut. Just saying, there's a stud coming right through that nut. But we're not gonna touch that yet. We gotta go underneath and do some work first. You gotta prep it. So the rear coilovers are very simple. What we're gonna be doing is we're gonna drop this entire spring perch. We're just gonna remove it from the spindle itself. When that drops down, you're gonna have access to the spring, and we're gonna be able to pull this strut out itself. So the lower shock mount actually bolts into the spring perch with these E12s, but you can remove the shock itself from the mount by taking off the nut at the bottom of the mount, which is a 17mm nut, and you would counter hold the strut itself with a 15mm open-ended wrench. So with that nut out, this strut is just going to stay attached to the body when we drop this spring perch. Now before we drop it, there are going to be alignment specs with this spring perch, and just so that way we don't really screw them up too much, since you're going to need to get alignment afterwards anyways, but for the time being, we're going to mark these eccentric bolts so we can get them tightened up at that same exact spot. And do that on both sides. Now this one is not an eccentric bolt, so you don't have to worry about it. So what we're going to do, we're going to go and loosen these E12s. That way it's easier to remove that lower shock mount once that spring perch is hanging. We're going to loosen this eccentric bolt and nut, and that's going to allow us to drop this spring perch all the way down without stressing out that bushing. On the driver's side, the only difference, before you do any of this, you're going to want to remove this headlight level sensor. Just a 10mm nut, and you want to counter hold this stud with a 10mm open-ended wrench. And just goes like this, right through here. So nut from this side, and a counter hold with the 10mm wrench on this side. So this is a 21mm nut, and it's an 18mm bolt on the other side. So we just need to loosen it enough so that way this whole spring perch will move independently of the bushing that's in there. Now this section to the spindle is also a 21mm bolt and nut. We're just going to loosen it right now, but we need to support the bottom of this before we take the bolt out completely. Now as we lower this whole spring perch is going to come down, and then we can release the spring. So your strut might get stuck in the mount itself, so you might just have to use a pry bar and keep pushing it out. And you want to still have your support there, that way the spring doesn't just shoot out. Now you might be wondering, why didn't we just take the shock mount itself out? And technically you could, but it does get hung up on this bar right here, which makes it a lot harder to pull out the entire assembly. And this way, this shock is already blown, so we can just push it up now. Now you just want to slowly lower it and grab the spring. Bam. Now most coilovers are going to come with an adjuster for the spring, and that adjuster is actually going to go into the body right here where this cup is. and that's going to allow you to adjust that spring height so you can adjust the ride height. So what we need to do, we need to remove this cup. It's just held in with pressure. You just get yourself a mallet, and a couple of taps, and it should pop right out. Bam. I'm going to go ahead and pull out this shock mount with the two E12s. And you can see how hard it is to get it out. You got to twist and turn it to pull it out. All right, that's being ridiculous. Bam. This thing is torn up. Now to remove the strut the rest of the way, we got to bring the car back down and go back in the trunk. To remove the strut, you have a 16mm nut. You're going to counter hold the piston with a 6mm socket or wrench, whatever you want to use. Push the strut up. Okay, ready? Pull it down. So you have the nut, and then you have this bushing. From underneath, you're going to have this shock mount insulator first that goes into the body. Then you have what's left of the shock mount bushing, and that's going to be through this stud section right here, through this spacer, I should say. Then you have this washer, and you have the shock bellows, which this shock is completely toast. Everything is disintegrated. Yeah, it's gone. So here's the ECS tuning side. It's a little bit different because the actual piston or shaft of the strut is thicker than the stock one. And that's why they give you these washers. So the way you need to do this, we're going to remove this adjuster first. We'll put it on later once everything's installed. And this is just to adjust the damping. So you just want to loosen, unthread this silver section. The top section actually turns this whole rod, and that's what adjusts the damping. So this washer is going to go from the top of the car. This washer stays on the bottom. Here's the bottom section. I'm going to take this middle section out. Slide this onto it. Now here's the nut that's provided. And this goes on from the car. But we're not going to be using this top section. And this foam piece is actually glued to this washer and nut. So we need to cut it off. So there's only certain sections that are glued. We're going to use the blade. Now be very careful. I already cut myself once. And I'll also link down below aftermarket options. I believe Turner Motorsport makes a different bushing material. And you can just get that. That will be much easier. See how close that was? So from inside the car, we would have this, then that, then the nut. Now as far as the shock is concerned, as you can see, the shock is also threaded. This lower section is threaded, so you can adjust the height of the shock. Now the way this works is you want to technically preload this whole system, so there's only a limited amount of travel inside of the shock itself. This shaft or piston, it can only travel so much. So the way I usually like to do it is I like to set my ride height with the spring. That's what controls the ride height in the back. You set it with the spring, and then at full droop, so when there's no load on the actual spring or shock itself, when the car's jacked up, we want the piston of the shock body compressed about 1 inch. So technically you want it about 1/3 compressed. We're just going to go with 1 inch. So we want this compressed 1 inch when the suspension's at full droop, because the piston can only move so far. After it reaches a certain point, it can't come out anymore. So we want to make sure that even at full droop, it's still got some kind of preload on there. And then when you go up through bumps and when the car's weight is on it, it'll compress and you have enough travel in the shock itself. Now this spring right here, this is the coilover spring. We have this adjuster. This is a section that's going to go into the top, and this allows us to adjust the height of the spring. It just spaces it out from the body itself. So you can adjust it like this. With the ECS kit, we also have this extra spacer. Since we're not lowering the car like crazy, we're going to remove this bottom section. We're going to insert this. And this is going to go inside of this, because it's spacing it more. If you really wanted your car slammed, you can just forego this entire section and just leave this rubber isolator. And you also have this rubber gasket material that goes on the top. So this goes inside the body in that hole, and this bottom section goes into the spring perch. Now this goes on here like that, goes into the car, you put this from the top, and you thread it in. Let's get to it. Ain't nothing to it but to do it now. We're gonna put this, I'm gonna insert it. Now that it's in there, we're gonna have our lovely helper hold it while I go inside. What you laughing at? Guide this shit in there. Come on. First, we're gonna install the new shock mount. You wanna make sure these nuts are visible from the top. You don't ever wanna lose your nuts. And then we take our 2 bolts, the E12s, and we're just gonna loosely put them in right now. The reason I'm putting them in loosely is so that way it can help us guide. We can move the mount around and guide it into the piston or the shaft of the shock. And you can also loop this up with some dish soap, and that's gonna make it easier for that piston to just go in there. Now the way the spring's gonna go, this is gonna go into the body, and it sits against that. Then you get the spring perch coming in from the bottom. This bottom section sits inside of here. You wanna make sure you have this nut removed from the shock. That way the shock can go inside the mount. Now you might need to use your pry bar to get the spindle lined up with the spring perch. And it just slides right in. You want to keep going until this bolt hole lines up, and you want to make sure that the shock shaft is going into that shock mount. And you'll see the threaded section pop out from the mount. Now you just take your bolt and insert it through. Make sure it comes out the other end, and then take your nut and thread it on there. So now we're not going to put this nut on the shock on the bottom until we have our ride height where we want it, because we don't want to put too much stress on the piston that's inside of the shock, just in case we don't have the height of the shock set properly. So now you can lower this, and you can see that the spring is actually still pretty compressed right now. There's a good amount of pressure on there because we have that spacer in there, but we still need to adjust where we want the height of the actual ride height to be. As you can see behind me, the car is actually put completely back together. I've got the ride height, everything dialed in, everything torqued down, and I had to do this before I could film it because I needed the lift, so I had to pull the car off. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm just gonna take the wheels off. I'm gonna show you guys the process of how to adjust your ride height and how to get everything dialed in and what all needs to be torqued down and when. So I'm gonna start here in the front. The front coilovers are pretty simple. So here's what our ride height looks like right now. You can see the picture right here. Now for us, I've threaded down the actual threaded section of this whole coilover into the coilover body. So you want to thread it into it to lower the car, and you want to take the thread section out if you want to raise the car. That's effectively moving this whole spindle assembly up and down based on wherever you want it. Now you don't really want to mess with the spring. The spring does need to have some preload on it, even at full droop. So we're at full droop right now because there's no load on the suspension, and we've got the spring preloaded about 1/2 inch to 1 inch depending on whatever you want it to be at. Usually most coilovers, the spring's already going to be set where the preload needs to be. So we got that preloaded. There's no movement in here. We've got all these collars tightened once we got the ride height where we wanted it to be, and you want to replicate that on the other side as well. So you want to make sure everything is exactly the same because you don't want one side to be higher than the other. Now once you have that done, we're going to put the adjustable sway bar links in. Now the sway bar links, you want to adjust those once you have the car at ride height. So you put it on ride height, you put your wheels on, and you either put it on ramps or something like that, as far as any makeshift ramp so you can get underneath the car with the whole body weight of the car on the suspension. And then once you have that, you want the sway bar links to be in a neutral position. Both ball joints have to be in a neutral position, so you kind of want them a little bit right close to the middle if possible. And that way, if it's moving, if you're going over some dips or anything, it does not max out that ball joint and it doesn't break it. So you can adjust the sway bar length however you need it, and you also want to make sure that the sway bar is not going up and down and it's not going to hit anything in its whole path of movement. One thing I did notice is the actual brake line bracket that's held onto this coilover body that goes right next to the sway bar link. That bracket, you might need to bend it a little bit to get the brake line out of the way so the brake line doesn't hit that sway bar link. For us, this passenger side is still hitting, so I'm going to bend the bracket to make clearance for that. And you just want to look over everything. Once you have those coilovers on, whenever you do any suspension work, you want to make sure there's no wiring, no connectors, nothing hitting anywhere. And even during the whole path of movement, you want to make sure everything is set. Now, another thing that you want to make sure that you tighten and torque down at ride height with the body weight of the car on the suspension are those control arms. So once you have everything torqued down, then you can lift it back up and you can do the final torque if you really need to, if you couldn't get it from underneath. And that's just so that way those bushings and everything are loaded at the proper section. You don't want to load up the bushings at full droop, because then when you're at ride height, those bushings are already super loaded, and then whenever you compress the suspension even more, it's going to load it even more, causing it to tear. Now, I've got a whole separate video that goes over that whole concept. It'll be linked down below in the description. Let's move on to the rear. Now, when it comes to the rear suspension, it's a little bit more tricky, mainly because the spring is separate from the shock itself. So you have adjustability on the shock, you also have adjustability on the spring. So the spring is what's going to set the ride height, because the spring has that adjustable collar, which you can twist and turn to increase that threaded section to space out the spring from the body, or you can compress it to bring that spring closer to the body, which will lower the car. Now, you want to get that ride height set as well before you really start messing with the shock itself. So the shock has a whole threaded body as well. It's the same concept. You release the collar and you can thread it in to lower the shock, or you thread it out to bring the shock, make it extend it. Depending on how low you have the car is what's going to determine the height of your shock absorber. So for us, we've got our ride height set, and then we have about 1/2 inch to 1 inch of compression of this actual damper itself at this current shock height. And this is at full droop. So what happens when the body weight rests on the suspension at ride height, it's actually going to compress the spring and all of that a couple of inches, and it's going to compress the damper a couple of inches as well. Now, what you want is when the ride height is down, you still want a good amount of shock movement. So for us, we have about 3.5 inches of shock movement at ride height. So at ride height, we're actually compressing the piston about 1/3 of the way. So that means we still have 2/3 of compression available, and you have that 1/3 for it to rebound back based on if you're going over any bumps, dips, and stuff like that. Now, you don't want your shock set to the point where it's always bottoming out, because then you're going to ruin a lot of stuff and your suspension is not going to feel right. So you want to make sure that you do have that travel both ways. Now, just like the front, you do want to torque down all of those control arm bushings at ride height with the body weight on the suspension. That way, everything is torqued down at ride height. It's not getting overloaded. None of those bushings are. Some of these bushings in the back are monoball type bushings or ball joints, which doesn't really matter as much on those, but you still want to try to get everything dialed in, especially if you do lower your car a lot more than stock. Usually what will happen is whenever you go get an alignment after you do all the suspension work, and once they make all the adjustments, they're going to torque everything down. Now, for us, the main arm that we had to do was that lower control arm with the spring sits inside. I had that torqued down at ride height with the body weight on the whole suspension. Now, when you're tightening down the lower shock mount for this shock, you want to make sure you're holding the shaft with a 15mm open-ended wrench while you're tightening the nut from the bottom of the mount. Now, once you have your ride height dialed in where you want it, make sure it's the same on both sides, and then you want to make sure all of those collars are locked in place. So for the spring, you want to lock the two collars against each other, that way they're nice and tight, and on the shock absorber, you just want to lock the collar against the lower shock body. With your ride height dialed in, now you got to figure out if you like it soft or if you like it hard. So there's 32 levels of adjustment in the front and the back, and all you got to do is use this little knob, and you can make it softer or you can make it harder. So with that adjustability, you can fine tune how you like your ride quality to be. So what I would recommend doing first is go fully hard and then dial it back about 7 or 8 clicks and then see how that feels. And from there, you can adjust how soft you want it, or if you want it harder. If you like it like that, you leave it like that. So it's very straightforward, but in the front, we do have an issue with the strut bars. When the strut bars are in place, it's going to be really hard to get this dialed in, but these are removable. So you just pop them in and they pop right back out. Let me show you. So this just goes right into the middle of that body right there. And you can see how there's a hex end and there's a hex end inside of there. So once you put it in, you're gonna feel it lock in place. So now the diagram on the actual knob itself tells you which way to go for hard or which way to go for soft. So we're gonna go all the way hard. And you should feel a click. And once it stops, that means you're at the end of the adjustability. So we're all the way hard right now. So we're gonna dial it back 7 notches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now we're semi-soft. And you wanna do the same thing on all of them and then adjust based on that. So you can adjust the back separately from the front. And while we're here, you can actually adjust the camber of your car. When you lower a car, naturally you're gonna get a little bit more negative camber. And if you wanna correct that to get it back to almost close to factory specs, you can adjust that camber by loosening those 4 Allen screws and moving it whichever direction you need it to go. Now this will be best left to whoever's doing your alignment. They should be very familiar with that, and they might need to move those screws around because they're separate sections where you can adjust those screws. You can unthread them completely and move them over one hole. That way you have more adjustability. So it all depends on whoever's doing alignment, whatever specs they want to set it at or whatever specs you want it set at, you can advise them to do so. Once you have your adjustments done, I would actually remove these and leave them in the glove box because they're not just fitted on there. Then you can go ahead and reinstall the strut bars, torque all that stuff down. The bolt on each strut tower is an external Torx 14, and you want to make sure it slides into that external Torx 18 in the middle of that windshield. Make sure they both slide in, and then you want to tighten that one down as well. All the torque specs will be listed down in the description box. Let's move on to the rear. So when it comes to the rear shock, you want to make sure you have the bushing, then the washer, and then the nut. You want to torque everything down. You're going to have to counter hold the shaft while you torque down the nut. Once you have all that done, then we have these 2 knobs right here. These knobs are for the adjustment. You can choose whether you want it softer or harder. This silver section threads onto the shock itself, and this is what actually does all the adjustment. So you want to go and finger tighten this. That's going to put this Allen head into the middle of that shock. And now you can adjust it from soft to hard. Just like the front, I like to do this fully hard, and then you dial it back 7 clicks, and you adjust from there. And you don't want to put any of your trunk stuff back in until you have all the adjustments made, because all of this is going to be covered by the trunk carpeting. Now when you're turning this adjustment knob, you are going to feel the clicks. And once it gets to the very end range of it, it's going to stop clicking and you're going to feel extra resistance. So make sure you do not go past that. And just like that, we have our ECS tuning coilovers installed. Now, if you have any questions, make sure you leave them down below. All the torque specs, the links, all that stuff will be in the description box down below. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in our next video.